Today, we're diving into a period that, well, honestly kind of gives me the chills. We're going to talk about the Weimar Republic
Ah, yeah. Germany in the 1930s.
and how it went from a functioning democracy to, well, a full-blown dictatorship under Hitler.
All in just 53 days.
53 days. It's a scary thought, right? I mean, it really makes you think about how fragile democracies can be.
It really does. And it highlights how quickly things can unravel when the right conditions are in place, I guess you could say.
Right. And for this deep dive, we've got a mix of stuff to work with, articles, historical accounts, that kind of thing, hoping you can help me connect the dots a bit.
Yeah.
The political maneuvering, what was going on in society at the time, it's all a bit tangled.
Sure. Happy to help sort through it.
What I find particularly unnerving is that it wasn't like a violent overthrow or anything. This all happened legally, through the very institutions that were meant to protect democracy.
You're right. It's a bit of a paradox when you think about it. But that was Hitler and the Nazi Party's strategy. They weren't just going to storm the Reichstag. They were smarter than that, much smarter.
They were playing the long game.
Exactly. They really understood the ins and outs of the political system, the Weimar Republic system, I mean. And they used that knowledge to their advantage.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit. Let's go back to 1933 Germany.
Yeah.
What was the situation on the ground? I know there was the economic turmoil after World War I and all that, but what else was going on? What made the country so vulnerable to these, well, extremist ideologies?
Yeah, you're hitting on a key point there. Germany, after World War I, it was a wounded nation, deeply wounded. The economy was in shambles, like you said. Inflation was out of control. Unemployment was, well, through the roof. And then you had the Treaty of Versailles.
The treaty that officially ended the war.
Right. And it imposed these really harsh penalties on Germany. Many Germans felt it was deeply unfair. And that created this climate of resentment, instability, like a breeding ground for extremist movements.
Because these movements, they offered solutions, or at least they pretended to.
Yeah, they offered scapegoats, someone to blame. It was a very dangerous mix.
So enter Hitler and the Nazi Party.
Right.
They played on this sense of national humiliation, the economic anxiety, all of that. But their ideology, it was also rooted in anti-Semitism and nationalism. How did they manage to gain traction in a democratic system, I mean?
They were masters of propaganda. I mean, they really understood how to use it, and they also knew how to exploit the weaknesses of the Weimar Republic's political system.
Weaknesses? Like what?
Well, for one, the Weimar Republic had this system of proportional representation, which meant even small parties could get seats in parliament.
Ah, I see.
The Nazis, they used this to their advantage, appealed to a broad range of voters, people who are unhappy with the status quo. And their message, national revival, blaming minorities for all the country's problems, it resonated with a lot of people.
It's like they took the system and turned it against itself.
Yeah, in a way, that's exactly what they did.
It's chilling. And that's where the conservative elites come in, right? They saw the Nazis' popularity rising, and they thought they could use it to their advantage.
Exactly. They thought they could control Hitler, that he would be a useful pawn in their power games.
So they enabled him, thinking they could pull the strings.
They underestimated him badly. They underestimated his ambition, his ruthlessness. Figures like Franz von Papen.
He was a conservative politician.
Yeah, he was instrumental in bringing Hitler to power, actually believed he could tame Hitler, use his popularity for their own gain. Big mistake.
Huge mistake. And what about President Hindenburg? He was a World War I hero. Surely he must have seen the danger.
Hindenburg was old by this point and increasingly out of touch. He relied heavily on emergency decrees to govern, which, well, it weakened those already fragile democratic institutions, paved the way for Hitler to exploit them.
So Hitler becomes chancellor on January 30th, 1933, not by winning an election, but through backroom deals, pressure from these elites who thought they were in control, but then things, well, they escalate pretty quickly, don't they?
Oh, yeah. Immediately, Hitler starts consolidating power, puts loyal Nazis in key positions, further eroding the checks and balances that were supposed to be there. One example is Hermann Goering, high-ranking Nazi official. He was made minister without portfolio, a very powerful position.
So he was setting the stage for something much bigger.
Oh, absolutely. And then came the turning point, the event that changed everything, the Reichstag fire. February 27th, 1933.
The burning of the Parliament building.
Right.
I remember reading that there's still debate about what caused the fire. Was it an accident, or did the Nazis actually stage it themselves?
Yeah, to this day, historians still debate that. The exact cause, I mean. But regardless of who started it, Hitler, well, he was a master exploiting situations like that.
So he used it to his advantage.
Oh, expertly. He blamed it on the communists, said they were a threat to national security. And using that as his justification, he persuaded Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag fire decree.
Which basically suspended civil liberties, right?
Right.
Gave the government all this power to arrest anyone they wanted.
Exactly. It was essentially a state of emergency, paved the way for, well, everything that followed.
Freedom of speech, assembly, the press, all gone just like that.
And the police, now they had almost unlimited power. They started cracking down on anyone who opposed the Nazis, especially the communists and social democrats. Thousands were arrested, detained without trial. It was a climate of fear.
Designed to silence any opposition.
Very effective.
This was calculated. Eliminate his rivals, solidify his grip on power before anyone could even think about resisting.
Absolutely. And with the opposition neutralized, with the public terrified, Hitler calls for new elections, March 5th, 1933. He wanted to legitimize his rule, or at least make it look that way.
But even with all that, even with the intimidation, the Nazis still didn't win a majority, did they?
Nope. They got 43.9% of the vote, which is a lot, sure, but it's still not a majority.
So how did he go from not having a majority to basically being a dictator in just a couple of weeks?
Well, that's where the Enabling Act comes in.
That's what I've been waiting to hear about.
It's a chilling example of how democracy can be dismantled legally from within. But I think maybe we should save that for the next part of our dive.
You've got me hooked. Can't wait to hear more about this Enabling Act and how it all played out. All right, so where we left off, Hitler was chancellor, his power was growing, but he still didn't have that majority in the Reichstag.
Yeah.
And then comes this Enabling Act. What was it exactly? And how did it basically hand him absolute power?
Well, the Enabling Act, you could call it a legal coup. Basically, it was a law passed by the Reichstag itself that gave Hitler dictatorial powers for 4 years.
Hold on, so the German parliament voted to give away its own power? How did that even happen?
It's a combination of things, really. First, you have to remember the atmosphere at the time. It was pure fear, intimidation everywhere. The Reichstag fire, well, that was used to justify a crackdown on any opposition.
Makes sense.
Especially the communists, social democrats, a lot of them were arrested. Others went into hiding. So their seats in the Reichstag. Empty, no one to speak out against what was happening.
So the very people who might have opposed this Enabling Act, they were gone. It's a chillingly effective tactic when you think about it.
It really is. And on top of that, the Nazis, they weren't just using fear, they were also making promises. Threats, too, of course. They did whatever they had to get the votes they needed.
Some members of parliament probably thought it was the only way to stay safe.
Probably. And the Nazis, they made deals with others. The conservatives, they still thought they could control Hitler, always underestimating him.
It's a recurring theme, isn't it?
It really is. And we can't forget the propaganda. It was relentless. They were constantly telling the German people that they were the only ones who could save the country, save it from chaos, from communism. And the Reichstag fire, well, that just played right into their narrative.
Because they could say, see, this is what happens when you let the communists run loose.
Precisely. They created this atmosphere of fear, this idea that there was a crisis, and then they presented themselves as the solution, the strong, decisive leaders Germany needed.
So you have this fear, this manufactured sense of crisis, and then the Nazis come in with their promises of order and stability. It's a potent combination.
It is. And in that context, a lot of people, even some members of parliament, they were willing to accept the Enabling Act. They saw it as a necessary evil, a temporary measure, they thought, to restore stability. They didn't see, or maybe they didn't want to see, the long-term consequences.
And those consequences were, well, pretty dire, to say the least.
Yeah. The Enabling Act, it was the official end of the Weimar Republic. It was the beginning of Nazi dictatorship. Hitler had absolute power, and he didn't waste any time. He used it to transform Germany into a totalitarian state. Within months, all other political parties banned. Trade unions, gone. The press, under strict Nazi control.
This was that Gleichschaltung you mentioned before, right?
Yes, bringing every aspect of German society into line, under Nazi control.
How did they do it? Was it all just brute force?
Brute force played a part, for sure. They had the SA, their paramilitary wing. They used them to terrorize anyone who opposed them. But it was more than that. It was also about propaganda, about manipulation, control of the media, education, even the arts. All of it was used to promote Nazi ideology, to create this cult of personality around Hitler.
So they weren't just silencing dissent. They were actively trying to shape people's thoughts, their beliefs.
Exactly. They created an environment where people were afraid to speak out, afraid to even think differently. And at the same time, they offered this seductive narrative
Mm.
of national revival, blaming the Jews, communists, anyone they deemed an enemy for all of Germany's problems. And they promised to restore Germany to its former glory.
It's a reminder that propaganda, that doesn't always have to be outright lies. It can be a mix of truth, half-truths, carefully crafted narratives that play on people's existing prejudices, their fears.
Right. And it also shows that even in a democracy, people can be vulnerable to this kind of manipulation, especially when times are tough, when they're facing economic hardship or social upheaval, or they feel like their way of life is threatened.
So the Enabling Act, it gave Hitler the legal authority he needed, but it was the fear, the propaganda, the exploitation of these pre-existing anxieties that allowed him to really consolidate his power.
That's a great point. Power isn't just about laws and institutions, it's also about controlling the narrative, shaping public opinion. And the Nazis, they were masters of that.
Were there any voices of dissent during this time? People who saw what was happening and tried to resist?
There were, but they were quickly silenced. One example is Otto Wels. He was the leader of the Social Democratic Party. And he gave this incredibly courageous speech in the Reichstag, denouncing the Enabling Act.
He knew it was a losing battle, didn't he?
He did. The Nazis already had the votes they needed. The SA were right there in the Reichstag, ready to intimidate anyone who opposed them. But Wels, he felt he had to speak out, to go on record opposing this blatant power grab.
A powerful act of defiance.
Yeah.
In the face of tyranny.
It really was. Sadly, it wasn't enough to stop the Nazi machine. With the passage of the Enabling Act, the last remnants of democracy in Germany, they were extinguished. Hitler had achieved his goal, absolute power. And Germany was set on a path that would lead to unimaginable horrors.
So we've seen how Hitler exploited the weaknesses of the Weimar Republic, how he used fear and propaganda, the Enabling Act, to dismantle democracy and establish a dictatorship. What can we learn from this? Are there any parallels to the challenges that democracies face today?
That's the big question, isn't it? The Weimar Republic's collapse, it's a cautionary tale. It shows us that democracy is something we have to constantly defend. It's precious, but it's also fragile. And I think that's something we'll explore more in the next part of our deep dive.
It's heavy stuff, you
Yeah.
know? Dissecting the fall of the Weimar Republic like this, hard not to feel a sense of, I don't know, dread, I guess? Seeing how quickly a democracy can just crumble.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder, are there any parallels to today? I mean, can we learn anything from all this?
Oh, absolutely. The historical context, it's unique, sure. But the way the Nazis exploited those weaknesses in the Weimar system, those tactics, they resonate even today. I mean, think about it, the rise of populism, nationalism, it's happening all over the world.
Yeah.
And a lot of it's fueled by those same things, economic anxieties, social divisions.
It's like that saying, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. We see how political polarization, it creates this climate where people are more susceptible to extreme ideologies. They want those simple solutions.
Right. And then you add technology into the mix, social media especially. The way misinformation and propaganda spread online, it's incredibly powerful. It can really shape public opinion, erode trust in democratic institutions. There's this quote, I think it was Goebbels, the Nazi minister of propaganda. He said, "Democracy gives its enemies the tools for its own destruction." Kind of makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah. Especially with how easily social media can be used to manipulate people to create these
Yeah.
divisive narratives.
Exactly.
So apart from those parallels, what other red flags should we be looking out for? What are the warning signs?
Well, one big one is the erosion of democratic norms. When leaders start disregarding the rule of law, attacking the free press, undermining the judiciary, that kind of thing, that's when you know things are getting dangerous.
Yeah.
Because it weakens the foundations of democracy, you know, makes it vulnerable to authoritarianism.
It's like slowly chipping away at the pillars that hold the whole thing up.
Yeah.
Eventually, it's gonna collapse.
That's a good analogy. And it's not just about what leaders do either. Citizen complacency, that plays a role too. Apathy, disengagement from civic duties, cynicism about the whole political process. It creates this vacuum. And that vacuum, that's what those who want to undermine democracy can exploit.
So we need to be vigilant, about what those in power are doing, but also about our own engagement with the democratic process. Okay, so what can we do? How do we safeguard democratic values, I mean, in the world we live in today?
Awareness is the first step. We have to be able to recognize the warning signs, see what's happening, and understand the tactics that are being used. We also have to be critical thinkers, especially with all the information flying around online. We can't just believe everything we read.
be wary of those narratives that prey on our fears, our prejudices.
Exactly. We have to be informed, engaged, discerning.
Okay, so informed, engaged, discerning. Got it. But is that enough? I mean, awareness alone doesn't seem like it'll, change things.
Right. You have to act too. Participate in the democratic process. That means voting, engaging in constructive dialogue, holding our leaders accountable, supporting organizations that promote democratic values, protecting civil liberties, all that.
And pushing for policies that strengthen democratic
Yep.
institutions, right? Like campaign finance reform, protections for voting rights, that kind of
Yes,
thing.
all of that is crucial.
And what about education? It feels like that has to play a huge role. We need to teach young people about democracy, why it matters,
Yeah.
about the dangers of extremism, how to think critically about the information they're bombarded with every day. They're the ones who are going to inherit all this after all.
Couldn't agree more. We have to give them the tools they need, the knowledge, the critical thinking skills, so they can navigate all the complexities of the world today. Resist those simplistic solutions that, well, that really aren't solutions at all.
Well, this whole deep dive into the Weimar Republic, it's been pretty sobering, honestly, but also enlightening. I mean, it really drives home the point that democracy, it's not a spectator sport, is it?
It isn't.
We can't just sit back and watch. We have to be active participants. We have to stay vigilant if we want to keep it.
Well said. The story of the Weimar Republic, it's definitely a cautionary tale. But it's not a prophecy, you know?
Yeah.
It's not set in stone. We still have the power to choose a different path. We just have to commit to those democratic values. We have to be willing to have those tough conversations. And we have to remember that protecting democracy, it's not a one-time thing. It's a constant process.
It's a good note to end on, I think. So to our listeners, I hope you'll, take these lessons to heart. Think critically about the world around you. What can you do in your community, in your own life, to uphold these values, these principles that we've been talking about? Remember, the choices we make today, they have consequences. They shape the world we're going to live in tomorrow.
And if you're interested in learning more about all of this, there are tons of great resources out there. You can explore primary sources from the time period, see those events through the eyes of the people who lived through them. There are also some fantastic books by historians like Richard Evans, Ian Kershaw. They offer really insightful analysis of the political and social forces that led to the rise of Nazism, the tragic downfall of the Weimar Republic. It's all there waiting to be discovered. And understanding the past, well, that's one way we can learn to navigate the present and build a better future.